tell us the story again. How did you hear about the Nobel Prize?
So first of all, since we are speaking in English, just call me Tom. Okay. I left Germany a long time ago, and I just can't get used to this Professor Südhof. You have to know my father was a professor, and so it instilled a feeling of, I don't know what to call it, of apprehension there, this whole thing. And my father used to insist, you can see how old I am, he used to insist that he not be called Professor Südhof, but Professor Dr. Niet. So things have changed. As many of you have heard probably, what happens when Nobel Prizes are decided is that the committee meets early morning on Monday, and they make the final decision only then, not before, in order to avoid any kind of leaks. Then, immediately afterwards, at 11 o'clock Swedish time, they call the recipients, or try to call them. In the United States, that would be 2 o'clock if you're in California, right?
In the morning.
So, great time. Luckily, I wasn't home. Unluckily, my wife was home. She received the call, but she actually was so confused that she didn't quite get it. I was on the way to a meeting driving through central Spain, and as I was driving along, I had my cell phone ringing, and it wasn't actually the Nobel Committee, because they couldn't reach me. They had no idea how to reach me. It was some journalist. So when that happened, they recorded the call and was actually available, maybe still available, because normally these types of calls are not recorded. I didn't believe the journalist, and I called back my wife, who was very happy to hear from me. But anyway, that's how it happened.
So, did you think it was a prank call?
Well, originally I kind of thought it, because I didn't quite expect it. You know, in science, there's a lot of people who think they deserve a Nobel Prize. And probably they do.
As we've heard tonight, you were born in Göttingen. Your parents were both physicians, with your father working on lipid metabolism. And I'm curious, what were the dining conversations at your dining table back home in Göttingen like?
Interesting question, because my father actually died when I was a teenager. And so the only thing I remember about our conversations is arguing with him about everything. So I don't actually ever had a conversation, as far as I remember, about a subject where we could agree on anything. I believe that that's normal, at least from judging with my own interaction with my kids. So I'm afraid there was nothing substantial that I could report.
You went to the Schule. Were you the nerd in the class?
When I tell people in Germany that I actually went to a Schule, the Waldorf school, they laugh. And they laugh because the Waldorf schools have a reputation of being non-academic. I think that that's not quite fair, to be honest, because their teaching style is different. I'm not an anthroposophist, and so I don't necessarily subscribe to the underlying beliefs, but I do think that the teaching philosophy that's there can be very useful to a child like I was, which is a little bit unusual, rebellious, and not quite fitting in. And because of that, for me personally, the Waldorf school was a great school to go to.
After the Abitur, why did you pursue medicine? What was your motivation?
One of the I believe not so good things about the German school system is that after you graduate from high school or the gymnasium, which is really a little bit higher level than the US high school, you basically have to make a decision what to do with your life. In the United States, you have 4 years of college, you can try out things, you can think about things, it gives you a lot more time to develop. In Germany, after you graduate, you basically have to commit. And I had a difficult time thinking about what I wanted to be. Different from many others, I had no intention initially to become a scientist. I found science interesting, but so I found many, many other things. In fact, I would have loved to become a musician, except that I completely lacked the talent, so not good at that idea. And I studied medicine simply because it was a career path that gave the possibility of doing something useful, something practical, and at the same time had a potential scientific perspective, an ability to think about issues beyond just treating patients. And so I thought that that would give me the best opportunities to explore later what I really wanted to do.
And during medical school, you were working at Dr. Whittaker's lab at the Max Planck Institute in Göttingen, and it seems a lot of your work was self-directed. Can you share more about that?
So in my career, after I had finished my preclinical studies and started to work in the hospital and do a little bit with patients, I realized that fundamentally, as medical doctors, we were educated to tell the patients, no matter what, that we were in charge, that we knew what was happening, that we could help them, that we could treat them, but that most of the time, that was a lie. Okay? And then most of the time, as a doctor, even the most advanced, most famous doctors had no idea what was going on. They had no idea why the patient was sick, and many times they had no idea what to do to help the patient. It's basically an empirical craft that people learn how to do, and they continue doing it. But many times then, and even now, there really are no treatments, there's no rational understanding. This is slowly changing, but it's still a very, very unfinished task. Because of that, I became interested in understanding more about the underlying principles, about what's actually happening, about the scientific basis for medical treatment, for understanding diseases, and that's why I started to work in a scientific laboratory. So I started to basically do this at the same time as attending medical school. I looked around where to work and what to work on, and I decided to visit several laboratories that were available at that time in Göttingen, and I talked to a lot of people, and the person who was most readily willing to accept me, shows you how good I was with my communication skills, was Victor Whittaker, an Englishman who had become director of the Max Planck Institute in Göttingen, and who was very, very established, very much English. You get the idea, right? He cheered and he ran around with English flags during the Argentine wars. I don't know if you remember. So I went there, and he gave me a project, and he allocated me to one of his assistants or his subordinates to work with him, an American. And I started working in that lab, but half a year later, that American guy, who was a very nice guy, left. And so here I was, in a big lab. I had an office that was bigger than my current Stanford office, all for myself. Okay, I had a lab for myself, but there was nobody there. And so, in some ways, that's typical of Germany. There's always tons of space, tons of equipment, but not always the people. Sorry. And so that's how I started my scientific career, working away in an empty lab and doing the stuff I wanted to do because nobody else told me what to do.
That brings us to the next question. As a young intern finishing medical school, how did you make the choice between academic science versus clinical medicine?
Again, it's not a clean cut. I initially started in clinical medicine and I decided to go to the United States as a postdoc, like probably some of you as well, only for 1 to 2 years. I actually had positions as a clinician lined up, both when I went to the States and I even had a position in the States that I never assumed. I just left, basically, then abandoned them. So I still believe that being a clinician is a really rewarding activity. I regret that I've never been able to really make much of a contribution. And my decision to completely do only science happened actually only several years later. I still think that it's a good thing to have some, at least, interactions with clinicians in science, and it's useful, and that is a very valuable perspective.
For someone like me who's not who has not the medical background, and I know this is a very complex question, can you explain how the brain cells talk to each other? Then that is the topic that you've been working on for the past 20 years.
I can try, because I don't really know. The way you have to imagine the brain is that the brain is composed of literally trillions of nerve cells that continuously talk to each other. And they talk to each other via transfer of a chemical signal. This transfer of a chemical signal from one brain cell to the other happens at a specialized communication structure called a synapse. And synapses are the most fundamental unit of information processing in the brain. There are many similarities to electronic circuits. And indeed, we often use language that is borrowed from electronic circuits. But there are fundamental differences about how the brain processes information from a computer. Both use circuits, vast overlapping circuits, to process information. But in the brain, although there is a hardwired circuit at any given time, that circuit isn't really hardwired. It continuously changes. So in the brain, information processing involves transfer and processing of information at synapses that are between brain cells, but these synapses themselves are not stationary, they change. And as a result, information processing by the brain follows somewhat different rules from those, let's say, in a computer. But the fundamental principle is that signals are being transmitted from one cell to the next, and actually from thousands of cells to hundreds of thousands of recipient cells at any given time, and that these signals can change as a function of plasticity of other influences, which constantly changes how the brain processes information.
And how does this research translate into our understanding and treatment of illnesses?
At this point, there is no direct translation. In the brain, there are many different types of diseases that have, I think deservedly so, received much more attention in recent years because they have become much more important for society. And that is because we live longer and because our lives have become more complex. So diseases of the brain, in fact, account for a huge percentage, the majority, of days lost, for example, to disability. They account for the unfortunate a loss of cognitive abilities when you get old, and many other untoward circumstances. The fact is that for most of these diseases, we do not understand how these diseases happen, how they develop, and because we don't understand them, we can't treat them. As an example, we have Alzheimer's disease, which I think everybody realizes now is becoming a huge problem for our populations. As we get older, we get more and more concerned. We don't really know why nerve cells die, why synapses die in Alzheimer's disease. We have no idea how to treat it. The work that we and others do doesn't directly translate. Science operates different from drug discovery. Science is sort of underlying drug discovery. We can't search for treatments until we understand how the brain normally operates and what goes wrong in the disease. At this point, we are reaching this position in cancer where there's more and more understanding, and so there's more and more rational drug development. In terms of brain diseases, we are not even close, and anything we do at this point doesn't get us into, let's say, visible range of treating diseases yet. Nevertheless, we hope, and this is purely hope and speculation, that by understanding better how cells in the brain communicate, how the information processes, how the brain processes information, that eventually we will also understand what goes wrong in these diseases and how we can potentially prevent or fix it.
I'm curious, what does your daily work look like? Do you have a big team? Do you work in a lab?
I haven't worked in a lab for a long time, unfortunately. Yeah, so I run a lab. That lab has about 40 people. Much of my time is devoted to trying to raise money for the lab because it's very expensive. That's the way it is. The other time is spent on talking to the people in the lab and trying to make comments, give advice, make suggestions on what's being done, and basically trying to guide the research. And those are the two major activities that I spend my days on, apart from all the ever-growing bureaucracy that is just killing us.
And I've heard that you don't believe in huge, big teams. Is that right?
Well, it's complicated. I have a relatively big lab. I think that it's important when you run a lab that you know what's going on in your lab and that you are able to actually communicate with people in your lab. There's all kinds of ways of running labs. There's lots of people who run labs who actually never talk to their people, and I think that that's not a good way of running a lab, but that's my personal opinion. There's other people who are very successful in doing this. It's really more a question of style. I think the most important thing for being a scientist is to be really sort of in close contact with the actual experiments, to actually know what's going on, to look at data, because that's what we do. So there's some super scientists who sort of in German they have this word schweben, who are sort of flying above everything and don't really know what's going on, but can make the big decisions. I would be critical of that, and I think that that's not good for science because they don't really understand what's going on. On the other hand, in science you need a critical mass. You need to be able to have people who have different expertise, who have different abilities to do certain things. So without the minimal amount of people in different areas of ethics, you can't really do good science.
Your wife is a neuroscientist as well with Stanford. What is a typical evening like in your household?
You don't want to know.
Come on. Yeah.
So, nothing to do with science.
I know that you have 3 little kids at home, and we all wonder, we're all distracted by these electronic devices. What is your take? How do we make kids interested in basic science nowadays?
I'm actually not sure that we need to. I do think, however, very strongly that we need to limit exposure of our kids to iPads and cell phones or whatever. I do think that one can waste a huge amount of time doing basically useless stuff. And I'm not talking about video games, which my kids at least tell me can be very enjoyable and relaxing. I'm talking about just stuff. So I think, personally, also from my own experience, that the most important goal of a child's education, something I'm trying to achieve with my own children, is to teach them or to induce them to focus on something interesting and do it by themselves. And it doesn't really matter what that is, and it depends on the age, whether it's building stuff from Lego, or writing something, or thinking about a story, or whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. The ability to focus, to concentrate, and to create. I think that that's the most important thing we can teach children, and it's more important than anything else. And science is something you can learn and acquire later on. But the habit, the ability of being interested in something and actually trying to understand something, that is something you can lose very easily. And you can gain this, for example, by becoming a classical musician, or by being interested in certain area of bird watching or whatever. It doesn't really matter what the subject is. It's really more the type of activity that's important.
What differences do you see in your basic education at the Waldorf Schule and the education of our kids today?
It's been quite a while, so I think that in the United States, a lot depends, just like in Germany, I suppose, on the kind of school you go to. I think there are schools here who are really fantastic, who give kids the opportunity to develop independently, who encourage kids to do their own projects, and to reward kids for actually achieving something, not just in terms of tests and numbers, but in actual content. My young current kids are in public schools. Some of the stuff they teach is okay, but a lot of it is way too directed towards tests and towards sort of achieving certain official benchmarks, whereas I feel that sometimes there should more focus on trying to support the development of creativity, of independent projects, of in general independence of kids than they do. So I think that every school differs, and that in general I don't worry about my kids not having enough education in STEMs, even though I'm a scientist. I much more worry about my kids being being too much educated to be reactive as opposed to being proactive.
Let's talk about Silicon Valley for a minute. You live near Stanford University, in the middle of Silicon Valley. The big tech companies dominate this region, of course. What's your take on this? Do you think that these companies take enough responsibility for what they do?
It's a very dangerous question. I wonder how many.
I mean, you're a scientist, come on. You can speak for me.
There is, I believe, an increasing awareness of the fact, and I think it's a fact, that the revolution of I don't know what to call it, of electronic communication, let's call it this way, has not only possibilities for freedom, but also possibilities, also dangers. These dangers, I feel, are getting more and more obvious and more severe. I certainly didn't recognize them as much as I do now. These dangers are that they create a degree of not only dependence on certain media and certain types of communication, but also of misinformation, of a lack of ability to actually check facts, for example, and at the same time of surveillance, of a lack of privacy. So you have these two sides. On the one hand, there's a loss of privacy, not a gaining of privacy. On the other hand, there's a loss of a feeling for what's actually true and what isn't, and how to navigate what is true and what isn't. I believe that the tech companies grow out of an obvious and understandable desire to create profitable companies that would dominate their sector and would be basically economic powerhouses. And in that effort to achieve those goals, maybe sometimes the idea of social responsibility was not completely considered. In addition to that, at least in the United States, there is no real regulatory framework to deal with this. I believe that Europe is doing much better there, but even there's sort of hiccups and it's slowly coming into force. We need to, as a society, it's my opinion, and that's just my personal opinion, that we need to find some ways of dealing with this, because the danger of misinformation, the danger of not giving people the ability to actually find out what's true and what isn't, is enormous. And we have to be able to find ways of creating privacy and fact-checking abilities in these types of communication that currently don't exist. So I don't know if I can fault any of the people who are drivers of these developments for what has happened, but I think it's time to actually plead for some degree of legal or regulatory framework to ensure that our traditional culture that we have in our democracies, be it Europe, be it the United States, doesn't get destroyed by these types of developments.
Last question. You are a trailblazer, ein Wegbereiter in your work, and it seems like the freedom of thought played a big role in your career. How do you think today's political atmosphere is affecting the development of science? This is a nice question again.
I believe that that's a case in point. I don't think that in the pre-tech era it would have been possible to have a Congress where a sizable part of the elected representatives basically don't believe science. It's not that they are secretly not believing it, they basically feel entitled to say, I don't believe science, I think it's made up. And obviously I feel that that is something which is very worrisome, because science in its very nature is apolitical. There is nothing in science that's political. Scientists are political, yes. But once you have facts, they're just facts. You know, there's no question when you build a bridge and you engineer it, You know, you can argue about the measurements and the calculations, either right or wrong, and either of which will fall or it won't fall. There's nothing political about that. And so I think that comes back to the previous point that I worry as I grow older, which I am, that this whole idea that we have a culture which is based on science as part of the culture, which is totally non-political in nature. There's nothing political about a scientific fact. That may be getting lost, and I believe that creates two dangers. And so, as a scientist, I always try to emphasize that as a society we have to agree on what's actually a fact. And there's many things you can argue about, but you can't argue about the fact that the world gets warmer. You can argue about how to deal with it, but you can't argue about the fact that it happens. Or you can't argue about other facts. They're just facts. There's nothing to be. And this and so, yes, I'm very much for the freedom of thought and the freedom of expression, but I'm also for keeping people accountable for what they say and challenging people on the facts as opposed to interpretations and what to do with the facts. That's a totally different issue. That's something science can't speak to.
Thank you, sir.